Welcome to Tax Notes Talk, a podcast from Tax Notes, the leading source of tax news, information, and analysis.
Welcome to the podcast. I'm David Stewart, Editor-in-Chief of Tax Notes Today International. This week, CI status. When IRS Criminal Investigations Chief Jim Lee took over the department in late 2020, he had several initiatives he was looking to implement. Now, 2 years later, one of his first initiatives, the Advanced Collaboration Data Center, will be ready to launch later this year. To learn more about it, Tax Notes legal reporter Nathan Richman caught up with IRS CI Deputy Chief Guy Ficco to chat about the project as well as other CI initiatives. We'll hear more from Nate about that in just a minute. Later in the episode, we'll hear from Tax Notes international author Sharon Katz-Perlman about her article looking at the UN Tax Committee's work on international tax cooperation and its overlap with the OECD's two pillars. But first, Nate, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So could you tell us a bit about Deputy Chief Ficco?
Well, he's what you might call a CI lifer. He started at the division as a student and has been there ever since.
Well, all right. Could you tell us what you talked about?
In addition to the Advanced Collaboration Data Center, the ACDC, we discussed CI's recent analysis of its use of Bank Secrecy Act data and the division's continuing efforts to find fraudsters stealing from COVID relief programs.
All right, let's go to that interview.
So, welcome to the podcast.
Good morning. Thank you for having me. Really excited to talk with you for the next several minutes.
Well, let's start pretty straightforwardly. First, let's get to know you. What brought you to CI?
So I am an IRS criminal investigation lifer, as I like to call it. I basically my entire adult career, I started as a what we used to call a student co-op position with IRS criminal investigation in 1995. Worked with IRS criminal investigation while I was a senior through this part-time process, and then converted as a special agent shortly after I graduated. My family ties bring me to the IRS. My older sister is a revenue officer, or was a revenue officer. She's now, in recent years, moved over to appeals. But we are an IRS family, and starting in 1995 for myself, going through the academy and Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in 1996, and then moving on and started in the New York field office. Most of my time in downtown Manhattan, but I was up there for about 14 years. And then came down to Washington, D.C., spent time as a supervisory special agent, an assistant special agent in charge. I was very involved with the voluntary disclosure, the offshore voluntary disclosure program in 2009, 2010 and such. And then I ran I was our director of special investigative techniques, which essentially runs our national undercover program. I was our special agent in charge of the Philadelphia field office for a couple of years, and then came back to headquarters in right before the pandemic, and started March 1st of 2020. Ran our operations policy and support section, which later became global operations because we brought international back in, and was luckily enough and fortunate enough to be promoted to deputy chief in July of 2022, and probably 7 months or so in the position, and really loving the position and working alongside Chief Jim Lee and the rest of the IRS senior leadership team.
Especially when he sends you off to some of the fun junkets.
Well, we try to balance that out between the two of us so that we're not both away for extended periods of time. Chief Lee, particularly through some of his involvement with the J5, which we'll probably talk about in a little bit, has been very active and traveled to numerous locations in support of that. I've gotten a few myself. I did attend I went to the ILEA Budapest last year, the International Law Enforcement Academy in Budapest, and got a chance to observe training with some of the countries over there that our international training team was putting on. It was a phenomenal experience, and very much enjoyed that, and seeing the real impact of our transferring our expertise to these developing nations.
As you said, we're going to get to the J5 in a moment, but first, I've been hearing from Chief Lee since he took over about this really interesting new project that apparently is getting close to ready this Advanced Collaboration Data Center. Can you give us just some of the details on what this new project will do and how close it is to ready?
Yeah, so we're very excited about ACDC, Advanced Collaboration Data Center, and what it's going to bring. But I think to really do it justice, I just have to do a little bit of historical backtracking on or historical context of it. In about 2014, CI made the decision to establish a cybercrime unit in Washington, D.C., and then shortly thereafter established a Western cybercrime unit in Los Angeles field office. And we've been operating with those two as our real guideposts, leading units in the space, and have produced some phenomenal investigations, which I'm sure you're aware of and your audience is aware of. Predominantly in the money laundering, not necessarily in tax, but we're shifting, and I expect some more tax successes to come. But
A lot of the big darknet takedowns.
yes, and welcome to video and such like that. And so the CCUs were established, and then in the other now 18 field offices, we have 20 field offices in CI now. The other 18 field offices each have cyber coordinators and might have a one or two person. But as you can imagine, the software and the contractor support, which is so needed in these investigations, was predominantly dominated by the two CCUs. So in 2020, IRS CI took a look at our headquarters structure and decided to make some changes. And as such, I mentioned earlier in my bio about operations and international operations coming together to form global operations. Well, that was one move, but the other move was we elevated our cyber section to an executive level. And as part of that, recognizing that it's here to stay, and we need to get as good as we are, we need to continue to get better. It's like the old sports adage: if you're staying the same, you're falling behind. And we recognize that, and the ACDC is a real linchpin of that. So our plan with that is to really have the contractor support, all the applications, all the software and tools housed in that ACDC, which will be in Northern Virginia, and those other CCUs already, but those other field offices will have those opportunities to either remotely work with those applications or physically come to Northern Virginia and be housed for a day or two or a week or two or longer as needed in order to tap into those resources. And we think that's going to elevate our investigations around the rest of the country. So that's kind of internally what our plan there is. And then some of the partnerships, we really want this to be a public-private partnership that could be a model for others.
Let me just bear down on this to clarify something. Is the partnerships different from the contractors, or is this a mostly unified Venn diagram?
I think it's going to be heavily tilted towards the contractors, but I do think we're going to have financial institutions that'll be in there. I do think longer term, I think we'll have more of academia that we're going to look to leverage in there as well. Beyond the public-private partnership, then more of a total government approach as well. We've got commitments from other agencies. HSI has told us they will be placing at least one or two agents or analysts at the center. We've talked with Treasury and FinCEN, and we think they're going to be looking to participate as well. Again, maybe not a full-time commitment, but they'll have opportunities, and we're hoping that this is really going to be a model that others could that we can be proud of, and that this can take these type of investigations forward.
Are the cyber crimes units going to continue, or are some of the personnel going to be relocated, or are the whole units going to be relocated to the ACDC?
So the cybercrime units are going to remain. I think just by geography, I think that the DC cybercrime unit will probably have more direct interaction with the ACDC because it's going to be obviously in the same metro area. But the CCUs, as we call them, will remain and will continue to be a very pivotal part of our model for success. And to answer your question about, I'm sorry, they sort of opened with when can we expect it? We've been, as you mentioned, Chief Lee has been the chief since I think October of 2020, and this has been we've been talking about it probably since shortly around that time. We are hopeful now for a late spring opening, mid to late spring opening. We've had a few delays. Some of them were foreseen, some were unforeseen. Much like many of the people in your listening audience, there's been supply side issues and a few other items that when you start working with government development of locations tend to pop up that they're not necessarily intuitive to you. So we're hopeful. We've been going with the adage, we're hoping for June for the opening. As Chief Lee sometimes quips, we don't specify what year June, but we're hopeful it's June 2023.
I was going to joke about the last time he mentioned a month before that was the statement Marchish.
Yeah.
But it sounds like it's June-ish now.
Well, yeah, and maybe I'm deliberately setting lower standards, and if it does get done before June, that would be phenomenal, and we'll certainly do some kind of public announcement of that that will go out probably through our LinkedIn or Twitter pages.
Can you tell us some of the differences between what the ACDC will do and some of the prior initiatives like the National Coordinated Investigations Unit or some of these global partnerships? What will be different about what the ACDC can do?
Well, I think the NCIU, or National Coordinated Investigative Unit, was born probably about 5 years ago, and that is really an internal section in CI which builds algorithms off of data and big data that has national scope and tries to come up with the algorithms that will produce investigative leads out to field offices. They're going to remain. NCIU is going to remain. We've continued to develop that section. We've worked with our civil counterparts when appropriate on some cross-BOD, cross-business organization, cross-business unit initiatives, and that's going to remain. Again, focused on data, not necessarily specific individuals. The data sort of leads, and then there's a determination as to what is demonstrating potential badges of fraud and what would be more appropriate in the civil context. So that's going to remain. The other, some of these financial institution collaborations, and we could talk about the GFIS or the Wolfsburg Group. We can talk about that. I think that is driven towards the collaboration between the financial institutions and those. Although I mentioned that we would ideally have a financial institution, bank professionals, either housed at ACDC or more appropriate, maybe on participate and attend meetings at ACDC and collaborative. They're separate entities, and ACDC will be a government-led initiative that will have the other collaboration from those other groups, such as financial institutions. Whereas the banks, I think they're looking, they're trying to determine what works for their AML compliance and what works across nation, cross nation enforcement or collaboration, I guess, maybe more appropriate. I think you probably saw some of your listeners would have seen about a month ago, Chief Lee released a one-page document on BSA data and how that is leveraged by our agents on our investigations. And I think it's pretty powerful. It's just a great reinforcement that the work that the financial institution professionals, that when they do that work to identify suspicious activity reports, that it doesn't go into a black hole. It's utilized by us and by our agents to both identify investigations as well as support investigations. So I think that'll continue, and I think are very, very proud of our work with the financial institutions, very proud of our work with organizations like ACAMS or FIBA and other anti-money laundering associations as well.
So basically, the NCIU is people using tools, and the ACDC is going to be a big warehouse filled with tools.
Exactly. And the ACDC, I would imagine, because of the way it's going to be staffed with some of these contractor support and the ever-changing landscape of crypto and transactions and such, those tools are going to be they're going to be cutting edge. They will be able to develop and house those tools, whereas NCIU, as you accurately said, will be utilizing those tools as well as other data data-driven ideas, algorithms, and such to analyze the information that is provided to them.
We mentioned the J5 before, and so that's one of CI's most prominent global partnerships. But what's going on with the J5, and what challenge number are we up to?
Challenge, that's actually one I didn't prep for that number. It's got to be. Oh, I think we got to be up to at least 3 or 4 by now. I unfortunately have never had the privilege of attending one of the challenges and seeing how they work. I've been told we basically lock people in a room for 24 hours and say get to work and come out with great results. And I've seen the results, and there's been some great stuff. Yeah, the challenge is something that like I said, it's got to be 3 or 4 that we're up to. It's actually a concept, and I'm going to reverse my talking here and go back just 2 minutes before we talk about the BSA violations. We essentially took that same concept. We got together internal and external CI people. We didn't lock them in a room, but we kind of gave them a directive to come up with metrics and statistics and ideas that would accurately reflect the great work. And I think through that process, we probably identified about 40 or so that we then whittled down to the roughly dozen or so that made it into that presentation. So I think that the challenge is going to continue. I don't know what the focus will be on for 2023, but there will be a challenge this year.
Let's backtrack just a little bit more and start. I should have let you continue. Just give our audience the basics of the J5. What does it stand for, and who's involved?
Oh, yeah. So the J5 is the Joint Chiefs of Tax Enforcement, the criminal tax enforcement for 5 like-minded countries in terms of our tax system. So it's the United States, which is represented by IRS Criminal Investigation. It's Canada. It's the United Kingdom. It is the Netherlands, and it is Australia. And it was founded. I think as the story goes, it was founded when those chiefs happened to be together at I think it was an OECD conference, and they started talking about ways that they could take the concept of some of the great work that OECD does and try to implement. And it's grown dramatically. I think when we first started, I think there was just maybe a handful of investigations that were collaborative across the 5 countries, and now that there are dozens and dozens and dozens. And great work, and the Chiefs keep to the spirit of trying to have they keep to the spirit of trying to have communications amongst the Chiefs on a monthly basis, where they and get together in person every few months. But I will say it's a challenge because the number of investigations that are spawned that the U.S. is involved with is more than just a couple of people could handle and investigate. So we've really started leveraging our field offices to different field offices around the country to really be the investigating agents on these J5, these Joint Chiefs of Tax investigations. Chief Lee has been in place for almost 2.5 years or so. I believe there's been a few turnovers of some of the other chiefs. And I think that's good. And I think they'll, as new blood starts new ideas and such, a new direction starts coming into the group, I think it's going to allow it to even grow further and take on some new ideas and such.
So speaking of growth, as we've heard repeatedly, the J5 is not going to be the J6, the J7, but in 2022, there was this new companion, I guess, would we call it a conference or a group, the Global Financial Institutions Summit. Can you tell us much about that?
So the Global Financial Institutions Summit, and there was a meeting of a GFIS meeting, as we call it, in New York in December, and it was largely represented by the large financial institution, the Wolfsburg Group, and other large banks like that. And it's just allowing another mechanism. I'll say each J5 country has got robust public-private partnerships with financial institutions and others. But there wasn't a collaborative group together. So US had some relationships, UK had some relationships, Australia had some relationships. The logic or methodology behind the GFIS is to leverage all of those relationships together in an avenue and a vehicle that all the countries could benefit from that are in the J5. And the GFIS is really, that's the birth of that. And it's kind of in its infancy at this point. There's been that limited number of meetings, but we expect that's going to continue to grow because as our joint operations are going to continue to grow between the countries. So I think that's really the method of it. Yeah.
So 2 meetings so far. Is there a third planned?
I'm sure. I believe there's a third plan. I don't have any specifics or details, and I can't break any news to you or to your audience on that one. But I would imagine that there will be a third plan for 2023.
Support for this podcast is provided by the University of California Irvine School of Law Graduate Tax Program. This preeminent and innovative program prepares students to practice tax law at the highest level in the U.S. and abroad. Featuring a low student-to-faculty ratio, cutting-edge technology instruction, and dedicated career support, UCI's graduate tax program helps prepare students for a future in tax law. Program graduates are placed in top tax-related industries, practicing law in many major U.S. cities. Applications are open now. For more information and to apply to this highly selective program, visit law.uci.edu/gradtax. That's law.uci.edu/gradtax.
You were mentioning the BSA data a moment ago, and as you mentioned, Chief Lee convened a big announcement about CI's use of Bank Secrecy Act data. Why did you guys start with, because as I recall from that, Chief Lee said this was not a one-off announcement, these announcements are going to be regular. Why did you guys start that series of announcements?
So I'm sure there were others who had similar experiences, but for me personally, I was participating in Mexico City last spring at a sit-up or strategic dialogue on illicit finance, and I was sitting next to FinCEN Acting Director Him Das, and we were talking with the FIUs down there in Mexico, and I mentioned at that point that 15% of IRS subject criminal investigations were initiated from BSA data. And Director Das almost fell off his chair because I don't think he'd heard that stat before. And he really, really thought that was phenomenal. And then subsequent to that, Chief Lee had a conversation with Director Das, and we got our wheels sort of spinning. And under Chief Lee's direction, we thought, we've got a ton of this data. We should leverage it, because for all of my certainly my management career, anytime I speak to bank professionals or in forums, the common refrain is, we're doing all this work. You never tell us if our work means anything, because we can't, because active investigations, we can't tell grand jury rules and others, so we're not telling them, so they don't get that payoff, or they don't understand that the work really is so valuable to us. And I think Director Das, in his experience, had similar situation with regulators and congressional oversight. So getting the wheel spinning, we're like, we can do this. And then under Chief Lee's leadership, we had our SAC of our Los Angeles field office, Tyler Hatcher, really led the working group and brought together internal people from CI, from IRS Civil BSA, from some bank professionals, FinCEN. We had Treasury involved, and it was a multi-month process to get where we were comfortable, where we were able to release that last month. And I'll say, from me, and I'm a bit of a data geek here and data nerd, I look at that, and it's great information that goes outward to the public, is to say, yeah, this is important. But I also look at it and say there's tremendous opportunities to look at this and try to improve efficiencies. So when we talk about 2.0 and 3.0, which I think Chief Lee has mentioned, we're going to continue to try to perfect what data goes outward, but we're also going to look internally and say, okay, there are, and I don't have it in front of me, but say there are 90% of our investigations, for example, that use BSA data. What are the other 10%? Why aren't they using BSA data? Because as an investigator, I really can't think of many cases in my career in which I wouldn't want to tap into BSA data, or at least check to see whether or not it was there. So I think that this is going to be a multi-step process. We're at 1.0, and I think 2.0 and 3.0 are going to be coming, and I think you're going to be hearing different releases from IRS CI over the next year, 2, 3 years.
Can you tell our audience what particular stats you drew for 1.0, and even better, what more stats will be specifically in 2.0?
So for 1.0, we have an internal tracking system in CI, which we call CMIS, and that really tracks our cases, and that tracks what applications were utilized, how a case initiates. It tracks the number of the time, and when you see our annual report, prosecution rate, conviction rate, all that information comes from CMIS. 1.0 predominantly came from that system. So we've kind of exhausted what we can get from that system. Now the question is, what else can we glean from? So I think we're working with a couple of our internal data scientists to see whether or not there are additional reports that are maybe outside of that CMIS system, or potentially maybe there is some more tracking that's in CMIS that we can pull from. So I don't think we're going to be pulling from any magic database like a DOJ database or anything. I think it's still going to be internal CI data, and I can't really preview any one specific thing. 1.0 was just released, and I think Chief Lee has basically told me, all right, let's let this one sit a little bit, and then we'll sort of get our ducks in a row. I do think it's going to be collaborative again. I do think we'll get with Director Das and the FinCEN team. I think they've done some similar, or doing some things right now, which I think they plan to talk about in the future. We'll get with them, and then we'll probably before the end of 2023, there'll probably be a second release, which will look at some data a slightly different way.
I'm going to change gears a little bit suddenly and notably at this point. So, as you mentioned earlier, we're a few years into this pandemic, and there were all those big programs at the beginning. And I like to think of those as giant pots of honey, to which I think of them as fraudster flies are attracted. And I've been hearing a lot about CI from the beginning was going after Paycheck Protection Program fraud, and we've heard about all sorts of other investigations. How are those investigations going? And do you have any sorts of interesting recent case counts? Perhaps have you guys done much with publicly yet with the employee retention credit filings?
So, yeah, to your point, when the pandemic hit and through congressional action, different relief was spawned, it did create this tremendous collaborative effort across government to respond. And IRS CI was right at the forefront with other agencies and really utilized our financial investigative expertise in those investigations. And as you said, the majority of those investigations were SBA driven with PPP and EIDL. We've averaged, and I'll throw a stat out there, direct investigative time, which is the percent of time that our field agents spend on investigations. Since the summer of 2020, we've averaged approximately 7% to 7.5% of our direct investigative time has been spent on COVID related fraud. Now, the majority, not entirely, but the majority of our SBA response, the PPP and EIDL investigations, would fall into non-tax investigations. But there were, and there have been, and there continue to be other tax components. And you talk about refundable credits that are certainly paramount and still ongoing with some of those investigations. And CI has been, is continuing to be involved. I think I'm looking down at my notes here to try to get an accurate read of cases, but we've, as of January 31st, so just a couple of weeks ago, CI had indicted more than 10 cases. I think it's 11 cases of ERC cases across the country, and of them, a couple of them have been sentenced, but the other ones are still ongoing in the indictment phase.
Yeah, I was just going to mention, I saw the Bassett War and COS accounting indictment that just came out of Utah, I believe the first. Very useful to know that they were not the only ones being hit so far.
Yeah, that was a very big case. That was the Utah case that you cited. That was, I believe, excess of $11 million in false and fraudulent claims or credits that were claimed. So yeah, that was one, but there are a couple other ones out there as well.
So one of the other hot button issues we've been hearing about the IRS a lot lately is $80 billion of new funding. What is CI going to get from that? By which I mean, what's your cut, and what are you guys going to do with it?
So that is a great question, and what I can tell the audience is it's not that CI is going to get a particular check cut to them or an earmark from that money. And just to put it in context, and your listeners probably know this, but IRS, and I'll put it specifically to CI, is significantly smaller than what it was in years past. And just to sort of put a bow on that, when I started, as I mentioned, in 1995, we had about 3,500 special agents. We had close to 5,000 employees. Sitting here today, we have about 2,100 special agents and about 3,000 employees. So we're about 60% the size that we were. And even before the IRA and the $80 billion was passed, CI had been able to hire special agents. We've been aggressively hiring for the last several years, but finally
defeating attrition, right?
Well, finally, and it's interesting you say that. I was just actually reporting out in another forum from FY20, FY21, FY22. CI hired approximately 420 special agents in that time. We lost about 410 agents in that time to attrition. So yes, we are beating attrition, but we are only slightly beating attrition. Now, I think over the next several years, if we can continue to hire at that pace, I do think that we'll forecast to start plussing up. Not to the levels anywhere near we were in 1995, but to
maybe get up to like 2,500 special agents.
That would be a great target, or maybe even north of that, if we can continue to go for the same rate for the next several years. As we speak here, I got an email right before we began that our new announcement, our new 1811 special agent announcement, hit USA Jobs today. And this is so we're excited that we've got this. This announcement will be open for a while, hopefully the entirety of 2023, and we hope that we're going to be able to get in some really good professionals and increase our numbers. So you asked me a question about IRA and the $80 billion hiring. We believe that we have the funding. IRA is going to just increase that funding to allow us to hire. But really where IRA is going to really commit is going to allow us to devote money to resources like investigative technology and development, which is really going to take the tools. And we talked earlier about ACDC and we talked about NCIU and some other areas inside CI. That investigative technology money would allow us to develop tools that we think is going to take us forward. So there's not a specific cut that is going to go to CI, but I'm confident that through the process that IRS and Treasury are putting forth, I think CI, provided that that money is there for the entirety of its time, will be well taken care of to be able to function and actually improve our effectiveness through the life of that IRA money.
Plus, you guys are hoping for some more and better fraud referrals, right?
We are absolutely hoping for more and better fraud referrals, but it's the tail wagging the dog. I mentioned CI staffing dropping so much, as you know, and as the staffing of our frontline revenue agents and revenue officers dropped so dramatically. And they, in order to get fraud referrals, they have to develop fraud. And when you have fewer and fewer personnel on the front end developing fraud, less and less actually get to CI. So we're hoping that through their hiring and this is going to create some opportunities and some more fraud development for us and criminal fraud referrals here in the future.
Well, thanks a bunch. That's been a lot of really interesting, useful information, and hopefully our audience comes away correctly afraid of you guys.
Well, I don't want to scare everybody. I appreciate the time you give me, and if I could take my last 15 seconds, as I mentioned the special agent announcement, I'll do a recruitment plug to you. As I said, I'm an IRS family, but I've been doing this for almost 28 years now, and I think if you've got or you know somebody who's got that financial investigative expertise and wants a career in federal law enforcement, I think IRSCI is a great opportunity, and we look forward to getting a ton of really qualified applicants to hopefully join our special agent ranks here in the future.
Well, as I said, thank you again for joining us and for sharing the inner workings of CI.
Thank you very much, sir, and thank you to your audience for listening to me talk for the last little bit.
And now, coming attractions. Each week we highlight new and interesting commentary in our magazines. Joining me now is Executive Editor for Commentary, Jasper Smith. Jasper, what will you have for us?
Thanks, Dave. In Tax Notes Federal, Jameson Shipman examines the challenges the IRS faces in determining when to deny exemption applications. Jennifer Ray and Cap Pritchett examine the relationship of a recent tax court decision, Clark Raymond, to allocations of gain by private equity funds on dispositions of investments. In Tax Notes State, Tony Santiago provides guidance on navigating the generational tax leadership turnover. Darian Shansky and David Gamage argue that states should conform to the recently enacted corporate alternative minimum tax to combat corporate profit shifting. In Tax Notes International, Robert Van Brederode explains why he believes taxpayers should have standing to sue in cases of unauthorized government spending. Three Chiomenti lawyers discuss Italy's new tax regime on crypto assets and voluntary disclosure. In featured analysis, Robert Goulder examines the ousting of former UK Chancellor of the Exchequer, Nadim Zahawi. And now, for a look at what's new and noteworthy in our magazines, I'm joined by Sharon Katz-Perlman, a shareholder with Greenberg Trarick's Global Tax Practice in New York. Sharon, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yes, so we're here to discuss your Tax Notes International cover article titled, Definitely Not Boring, the UN Tax Committee and OECD Collide. So can you start off today by giving us maybe a brief overview of your article, please?
Sure. So the article really focuses on a resolution at the United Nations last November, just a couple months ago. And the resolution was called a Resolution for the Promotion of Inclusive and Effective International Tax Cooperation at the United Nations. And it had been put forth by Nigeria on behalf of a group of African countries that were seeking direct involvement from the United Nations into the international tax cooperation community. And it specifically asked that the UN take steps needed to ensure inclusive international tax cooperation and coordination. The resolution was adopted, ultimately. There was some concern, and the US mission to the United Nations submitted a letter kind of outlining some concerns that this resolution might be starting to creep into the work, the extraordinary work, really, of the OECD in bringing together so many countries around a platform and an approach to global tax. And I think what struck everyone was the use of the word inclusive, because inclusivity is the bedrock of the OECD's inclusive framework and BEP and everything else. So why then do we need this resolution? The United States actually tried to amend this resolution or pending resolution. It was not amended. It went through just as it had been laid out by the Nigerian delegation. And then the budget resolution that went along with the resolution itself specifically asked for the Committee of Experts on International Cooperation in Tax Matters, which is a group within the United Nations, to focus on this issue. And so the article talks about how do you reconcile this and what does it mean? And I think therefore that's the reason for the cover photo, which with tax notes with the two giant bulls with their horns interlocking, two giants collide. The article really gives, I think, a kind of a good history at that point about this UN tax committee. And it's been around for a long time. It's been around actually since 1968 in one form or another. And many people, even in the tax world, are completely unaware that this committee exists. I was completely unaware until I was approached and asked if I would consider being appointed to it. And I really had never heard of it. And I said, sure. And so I served for 4 years on one of the subcommittees on tax dispute resolution avoidance and the mutual agreement procedure. So a lot of competent authority transfer pricing focused issues. The committee itself is composed of revenue authorities from a number of developing jurisdictions, and the subcommittees reflect the same composition. So many revenue authorities, representatives from a number of jurisdictions. There were business practitioners, there were taxpayer representatives that were on this subcommittee. I was one of those. We had a couple of us, academics. And we also had input from the OECD, extraordinary input from Sandra Knapin, who heads the OECD's tax certainty unit now. She's amazing. And Jeffrey Owens, who was Pascal Saint-Amand's predecessor, leading the tax policy unit, also just extraordinary insights. And we worked together for 4 years. And so the goal of that committee is to provide a voice to developing countries. And that is, I think, where the Nigerian resolution comes from, a feeling that maybe the OECD's voice is the voice of 38 large established countries and not so much the voice of developing countries. And that's been a theme that's been around for a while. That's not new to this. It's been around. So, after going through sort of the resolution and what is this UN committee, the article really just raises sort of questions like, well, what now? Like, how does this get reconciled? What is the work of the UN committee now? How do they get involved? I think it's a lot of questions, and I just think it is fascinating, and hence the title, definitely not boring. I don't have the answers. I think this is going to be really an amazing thing to watch unfold over, the next year or two.
Yeah. Well, you touched on the idea or the notion that this committee is relatively unknown, even among tax practitioners, and certainly it is an interesting dynamic that they've created. But was there anything specifically that prompted you to write about this topic?
So I heard about this resolution, and because it was related to tax and it was in the United Nations, and because of my work on one of their subcommittees, I started reading about it and just started thinking, this is interesting. How is this actually going to work? And it was really, that's what started me off, just learning that this resolution was out there, then digging into the history of the resolution, finding out that the U.S. mission, it's really fascinating. And I don't think it's, pardon the phrase, like tax geeky fascinating. I think it's just interesting from just a very broad policy perspective that you can have these two giant bodies that are working in the same space. And yeah, there's an issue here. Is the UN coming too late in the game to the work of the OECD? And is there a chance that things can be derailed or a conflict could develop, because nobody would want that? So the question, how do you get this input in here now? And can you get this input in now? I don't know. I just thought it was so interesting. And so So as I was reading about it, I was thinking, wow, this is just so interesting. This is, and I just have always, since obviously I'm a tax lawyer and I focus on tax controversy, which is definitely not boring, but my whole career, people are like, what area of practice are you? And I say tax. And you can see it on their face. They're like, oh, boring. It is not boring. And, and I think that this and watching what is unfolding and look, the work of the OECD is in the newspaper every day. This is no longer just for tax people. So I was just fascinated by thinking through how is this going to play out. And so that's why I just sat down and started writing the article.
Wonderful. Well, I agree with you. There's nothing boring, definitely, about this article. It was very informative to me and engaging, and I appreciate you choosing us for the publication forum.
Happy to. Thanks.
So, Sharon, can you tell our listeners where they can find you online if they want to?
Yeah, sure. Obviously, the Greenberg Traurig website. I am there, and then I am on LinkedIn as well. And so, feel free to message me there or reach out there.
Okay, sounds good. Well, thanks again for your time and for coming on the podcast today.
Thanks again for having me.
You can find Sharon's article online at taxnotes.com. And be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, Tax Notes, for more in-depth discussions on what's new and noteworthy. Again, that's Tax Notes with an S. Back to you, Dave.
That's it for this week. You can follow me online at TaxStew, that's STEW, and be sure to follow at Tax Notes for all things tax. If you have any comments, questions, or suggestions for a future episode, you can email us at podcast@taxanalyst.org. And as always, if you like what we're doing here, please leave a rating or review wherever you download this podcast. We'll be back next week with another episode of Tax Notes Talk.
Tax Notes Talk is a production of Tax Notes. You can learn more about us by visiting www.taxnotes.com/podcast. When major media wants the straight story, they turn to Tax Notes. Thank you for listening, and join us again for another edition of Tax Notes Talk.
Want to see more like this? Subscribe for more tax videos. Special thanks to our executive producers Jasper Smith and Paige Jones, as well as showrunner and audio engineer Jordan Parrish.